Um, my early first experiences with Quakerism were that my family in Chicago decided that a Quaker school, a boarding school, was a good idea for first my sister and then myself. So when I was 15 in 1937, I was sent to Westtown without my really knowing anything about the school or Quakerism or anything, any Quakers. And it was an exciting experience for me because it was so different from what I'd known in Chicago, where I was going to a very liberal, progressive school run by the University of Chicago. And it was a very intellectual place, very good, but much more sophisticated. And living in my life in Chicago was much more sophisticated. And they thought, my parents thought, that it would be a good experience for me to learn more about the simple ways of Quakerism and get involved in. I think it was less that they wanted me to get involved in Quakerism than they just thought it was a good school. And so I went there, and the whole business of a boarding school is, of course, quite a big change from living in your own home and having the kind of social life that you do as a teenager. And there were so many restrictions and so many requirements of being such and such a place at a certain time that it was a big adjustment. One of the people that I met there, who has since been involved in Madison Quaker life, was Francis Hole, who was a teacher there teaching German. And I took a course, I took German from him for a year. And turned out he was instrumental in getting us involved in the meeting here when we moved to Madison. But the people I remember there at Westtown were, most specifically, was a teacher of English, Master Carol Brown, who was a fantastic teacher, and his sense of humor was so good and so sort of sarcastic that he inspired me to work, I think, and was quite an influence on me later on. I even wrote to him when I was in college. I thought he was a marvelous person. I went to meeting twice a week as part of the routine. There was a Thursday morning meeting and a Sunday morning meeting, which everybody was required to go to. We had a Bible class in the first year and the Quakerism course in the second year. And everybody had to take that. And we had a very simple life in lots of ways, but it was a crowded life with lots of activities that one almost had to fight off. There were so many of them. And I made some good friends there. I think it was, at the time, I was extremely rebellious about being cooped up on campus and not being able to go anyplace on weekends or see people outside of the gates of the school, but I realize now that it was necessary and that it was, in fact, an excellent school. And although at the time, for many years afterwards, I didn't really want to get involved in a meeting, it did grow on me, and I did find that later, here in Madison, I was taken with the idea of going back to meeting and getting involved with the people who are here.
So between graduating from Westtown and arriving in Madison, there was you had no connection with friends.
No, I never went to the meeting at Ithaca when I went to Cornell. I think there was one there. And then I was in the Waves, and I remember writing to Master Carroll when I was thinking about going into the service during the Second World War and saying, should I do this? I felt kind of strange about going into the service and doing something with the military. But he replied very wisely, I think, that if I sort of like the advice to William Penn got, wear thy sword as long as you can or feel you have to. And I guess I wasn't enough of a Quaker yet at that point, so I, at the time, thought that was the best thing to do. But never until we moved to Madison did I get involved in any other Quaker groups.
Dad, would you like to describe your the long years at Germantown Friends School and what notions about Quakerism you got there?
Sure. I started a lot earlier. I started at the early age of 5. Again, my parents thought that in Philadelphia the Quaker day schools were superior to the public schools, even though my mother's father had been superintendent of schools in Boston. They sent me and my brother to Germantown Friends School, which was one of many friends, quite a number of friends schools in Philadelphia. And started out in kindergarten there and went all the way through to graduate as a senior in 1936. So I never really knew any other kind of school. It wasn't as confining as a boarding school, of course, because it was a day school. And I wasn't able to compare it to other schools, but nevertheless, it was a great experience. We had to go to Thursday meeting. My parents were Unitarians, and so I went to the Unitarian church in the early years. On Sundays, along about elementary school, I began to make friends. Some of my better friends were Quakers, or belonged to Quakers families, and probably as much to be with my friends on Sunday morning as anything else, I started to go to friends meetings, the Chestnut Hill meeting or the sometimes Germantown meeting on Sundays. And it became, it was attractive to me because partly because I knew the people were there, and I think it was something that I was glad to do. After I got out of high school, I bypassed any form of organized religion again until we came to Madison. And it was, I guess, after you and Greg and the others came along, we thought it was important that you go to some kind of church-affiliated activity, and so that, I think that was partly why we came back to the meeting. We wanted to do it ourselves.
What sort of what was Quakerism like under the masters of Germantown Friends? Was it the same kind of Quakerism that we know today, or how did it differ?
Oh, only a small proportion of the students at Germantown Friends are Quakers. There's no great emphasis or influence of Quakerism in the day-to-day curriculum of the school, other than the Thursday morning meeting. That's about the only contact there is. There were Bible courses, which was a once-a-week class. So I would say that there's very little. Well, there's no discussion of Quaker history, of Quaker principles. None of that was brought up in the school.
It was in Westtown.
Francis Hole described some of his growing up in programmed meetings, and then later on becoming introduced to unprogrammed meetings. I would assume that meetings at GFS and Westtown were unprogrammed. Is that
Right.
They were.
so it
Yeah.
was silent meeting for worship?
Sometimes I wish they had been a little more silent than they were. Some of the elders in the Germantown meeting retired people, because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to come on Thursday morning, had a feeling that perhaps some of these students needed more Quakerism than they were getting. And they gave us sometimes the whole bushel on a Thursday morning. But it was, as I look back on it, it was very worthwhile.
I remember having meeting in the meeting house there. They still had women on one side and men on the other. The facing benches had women on one side and men on the other too. So all girl students sat in the center aisle, and men, boys. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I
The
wreck it?
microphone is in the way.
It's in my way, or?
Well, it's
Yeah, I remember too that dancing was hardly tolerated. I mean, music, dancing, and art were just beginning to come into the curriculum. I had one music appreciation course, I remember, and I think there was an orchestra, but and I had art courses, which I liked, but the girls, if you wanted to dance, you had to dance with girls. I mean, girls dance with girls, boys dance with boys. And we had a special room where you could listen to music and dance. And the girls loved to do that. I don't know what the boys did, but we used to dance down in this room, and it was way in the basement where they couldn't hear the music, you see. And then once a year we would have a dance social affair whereby you could have dates and so on. But social life was extremely limited, and it was, for that reason, all the more exciting, you know. So that, I'm sure, is very different now, and you couldn't, you had to get special permission to leave the school, and everything was quite tight.
Well, maybe it's we should move forward in time then to getting to Madison and discovering Friends Meeting, and learning about, find out what it was you discovered when you did find them. Go ahead, Mom.
Well, I remember that long about 1950, I think it was, when we had been here for 3 years in Madison, that either Francis or Agnes Hole, I think it was Agnes actually, called us up and reminded me that in fact her husband had me in a course at Westtown, and wondered if we might like to come to meeting. assuming that I was still interested in Quakerism. And at the time, we didn't have any car, and it was really very hard to go any place with little children and no car. So we didn't do anything about it. I said, thank you, I'd like to, but I don't know how we can do it. And then later when we got a car, not too much later, half a year or so, we decided, I think maybe she called again or something, and we decided that we would go, and it was being held in one of those student houses on campus where a religious organization, Lutherans I think it was, had a house on Murray Street, which we were welcome to use one room of on the second floor, and everybody crowded into one little room about the size of this area we were in now. There must have been 15, 20 people. And there we were with our little brood of 3 kids by that time. And I guess what I liked about it was very simply the fact that it was a quiet place where a mother of 3 little noisy children could get some peace and a chance to think some thoughts and perhaps get involved in a religious experience. But at that point in time, it wasn't very much of that, I don't think. It was just a kind of a relief to be able to share silence with nice people.
I think one of the things that influenced me anyway at about that time was having been in the military and been through World War II, I became more and more concerned with the situation the world was in and wanted to do something so that this could never happen again. And we got involved in a local group of people, some Quakers, but not all by any means, who started a group, it was a national group, United World Federalists. This was an effort to improve the United Nations to the point where it would not permit war to happen again. And I got very active in that, and of course I knew that this fit in very closely with Quaker philosophy, and I think that certainly attracted me to come to meeting and to talk with like-minded people about that kind of thing.
Were there friends amongst
yeah,
Federalists?
there were some. I can't remember which ones. I think Francis Hull must have been one of them. But it was, I think one reason that there weren't many Quakers in it was because the whole movement was started by a young ex-Marine, and the early people in World Federalists were ex-military people who had seen what war was like and wanted to really get out and do something so that it wouldn't happen again. And I still think it's a great ideal objective. I don't know how much closer we've gotten in the last 30 years, but it's still something you have to work on. And the meeting's efforts towards nonviolence in general, I've always thought were very important.
And there were other groups that you began to participate in about that same time? World peace organizations? Or?
No, I don't think so. Well, the United Nations Association, and that came along later.
What involvement did you have with the Madison Peace Center?
Well, that came along a little later.
Was it in
I'm
the 60s?
not
wasn't it?
sure. Chester Graham was the spearhead of that effort, and Jack Tiffany, among others, in Peace and Social Concerns. And we had a very active bunch. We even rented the Madison Peace Center rented a storefront down on University Avenue,
Mhm.
and we had all the peace literature we could find from any groups in there, and we had something going that was very worthwhile. We got out a newspaper called the Peace Times. This is started, I think, by Peace and Social Concerns, and I would hesitate to try to guess what year it was, but it was a a monthly newspaper, I think.
Must have been the early 60s, wasn't it?
Yeah, maybe. Which hopefully would try to document what various peace groups were doing in the community and in the state, in the region, in the country, in the world. And but it takes people like dedicated people like Chester Graham, because you need people to work on it all day, full time, to keep something like that going. I went to Washington. I remember there was a movement afoot in Congress to make it necessary. Universal military training. This would be everybody, every male would be drafted for a period of time. And our meeting got very excited about that, and they even paid for me to go to Washington to talk to our senator. I can remember Senator Wiley. I got an appointment with him. I went down there, I got into his office, introduced myself, and he said, "Well, very nice to have you here." And he proceeded to talk for 10 minutes, and I did not get a chance to say a word. And he said, "Well, it's been very nice having you here. Goodbye." Well, I had gotten my message in the letter before. At least he knew that the Madison meeting was concerned about it. But that was kind of an interesting experience in confrontational politics, I guess.
Did he at least refer to the issue
Did he?
in his speech?
No, no. No. Well, he did refer to the fact that we need to build up a secure nation here, so that nobody, Hitler can't develop again, or Stalin, or any of the rest of them. So we've got to be big and strong, and that was his argument.
Well, my recollection is of the 50s and early 60s is quite strong, that you were involved in the world peace effort as much or more than anything else, and that was probably among friends, that was the biggest effort, the thing we were working on the hardest.
Yeah, that's true.
What about your experience then with meeting in general, aside from the World Federalists? What sort of things were happening in meeting?
I noticed in my 1955 book here that I was on the Finance Committee. We met on December 14th. I'd had forgotten that, but I was on the Finance Committee. And
You were the treasurer for quite a long time.
I was
right?
treasurer for quite a long while. And Jenny was clerk for 2 years.
Well, that was in the 60s.
Well, yeah. later.
Yeah, I had a lot of different jobs. I remember doing the newsletter at one point in the 60s when it was not a very good newsletter. And I was involved in the Ministry and Council for a while. I think I was head of it for a while, convener. I was on the building committee, and we still are for many years. And recording clerk for a few times, but a few years. I guess the most important time for me was when I was clerk, because in those days we didn't have any assistant clerks. So you definitely went every single week to meeting unless you were deathly ill. And I was the first one there and the last one out, and I don't know now quite how it worked, but how I did it, but I was between 68 and 70, I think, for 2 years. And it was a very engrossing job because at that point, as we all remember, there was a lot of anti-war, anti-Vietnam War protesting going on. We bought the Helen Allen house next door, which was a big switch, big addition, and started the Friends University, I can't say anything. The coeducational center, Friends Center for students to live in.
Oh.
And this was
Co-op housing.
big co-op, yeah, and that was a radical thing to do. It wasn't my idea, it was Janet Hilliker's idea. She came with that thought to meeting, but we had to thrash that through, and it was a big success for quite a while.
Oh, that was something that the students wanted, and they went to the Dean of Women to get permission to have coeducational housing, co-op housing for students, which was something unheard of at that time. The Dean of Students said, what church do you belong to? And she said, we're Quakers. So the Dean sent them to the Quakers and asked them to ask us if we would sponsor and oversee this housing. And we had some meetings on that subject and finally agreed that we would, and we did. And it was very successful for a while. We rented a building. Well, there was one on behind where the University Y was, and then there was another one over on Johnson Street, which is still there. The Friends Co-op, I think it's called. And
we had to pay the rent, and then to make it legal with the university, and then students would pay us. We had to pay the person who owned the house, because otherwise he wouldn't rent it.
But it was an innovation on the university campus, and perhaps other campuses, for all I know.
Innovation was co-educational.
Co-educational.
Yeah, it was considered quite shocking at the time. Now, of course, it's...
Oh, we had to do some remodeling of the house.
Bathroom.
So that it would work for both sexes. So it worked, seemed to everybody's satisfaction, except when August 31st came along and all the students went home, leaving all the dirty dishes in the sink for us to wash.
And we had to go in there and clean it up over Labor Day weekend.
Yeah.
Never forget that oven.
Was that the first time Friends got involved in housing?
Mm-hmm. Not too long after that was the Quaker housing. When was that? And you were very involved in that. for elderly.
Yeah, well,
Was that in the 60s also?
in, I think that was late 60s or early 70s, there were federal funds available for housing the elderly and low and moderate income people, and since I was an architect, I was interested in getting involved in this, and I talked to the city about it, and they found a site. They came up with a site that they thought we would be interested in, and we looked at it. We were, and so I designed a 72-unit apartment housing, which is and is known as Quaker Housing down there on just off of South Park, which is housing for the elderly, and it's sponsored now by our meeting through Quaker Housing Incorporated. But that was another housing effort that Quakers have been involved in.
That began when?
I think it was in the late 60s
Maybe early 70s.
and early 70s. That program. It went on until Nixon moved in and shut down all the funds for that. And
Can we place that?
then it started up again, I guess, somehow or other. And that went along until Reagan got in.
Well, Quaker Housing has never stopped. It's just
No,
those
the
programs.
Quaker Housing
Yeah.
has been going steadily.
Laura Schlafer was the first one to
Yeah.
manage that.
First manager. Yeah.
Did a wonderful job.
You alluded to a lot of energy during the period that you were clerk, having to do with the war,
Mm-hmm.
with the Vietnam War.
Mm-hmm.
Can you expand on that a little?
Well, there were a lot of members of the meeting who were involved in protesting the war and in trying to conciliate between students who were protesting and university authorities who were having to put up with the damage that was going on. And Joe Elder was very active in that with, what's that called now? The courses and, gosh, what's it?
Teachings.
Well, no, those were going on, and maybe he was doing that, but I was thinking of the work in conciliation. That's not quite the right word, but Jack probably remembers.
Center for Conflict Resolution.
Conflict resolution, yes. And I wasn't involved in that, but Nat and I both did march. We were members of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, not Vietnam veterans, but the Veterans Against the War. And during those periods when Memorial Day, end of May, March, parades were going on, this group would follow after the uniformed people. We would follow marching with caps on, but no uniforms. And it was a very tense period, very hard to. For somebody like myself who was not a confrontational type, it was very tough. I had to persuade myself that, my principles were more important than the fact that I was bucking a kind of an angry, just one of many, but one who was bucking the military at that point, and sentiments were running high against people like that.
Well, it was also true that during that period we had an increase in membership, not membership, but attendance.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of students who who wanted to get involved with what Friends were doing about the war, and I guess we had meetings that were filled with people sitting on the floor, and in fact we had some pretty scruffy people coming in sometimes, which made it tough on the clerk to keep things a clean and orderly way. But we did have a lot of people that the meeting with, through its various committees, was able to help either in
Draft resistance?
draft resistance, getting CO status and that sort of thing.
Yeah, we had a regular person who was not hired, yeah, maybe we did pay them to do draft counseling, and one of them is a lawyer here in town who doesn't come to meeting anymore, but what was
Scott Herrick?
Scott Herrick, yeah.
Yeah,
Who's,
heard that name before.
yeah.
AFSC was kind of the heyday of AFSC too back then, right?
Mhm.
They were involved in the draft counseling.
Mhm.
That's right,
They
yeah.
were the focus
They were,
for it.
they were supporting, every meeting tried to have a draft counselor who would help young men who didn't know what to do about the draft and whether to resist being involved in the Vietnam War. So it was a very hard time, and a lot of people were disappearing into Canada because they couldn't stand the idea of being drafted or forced to fight. So some of our members of the meeting moved away.
Yeah, there were
I
several
think of 2 or
several
3
couples
families at
who
least.
just up and left to go to Canada with, well, who?
Well, one was a psychiatrist family, I remember, who went to Vancouver, and then the Walkers moved up
Walkers went up into
to
Ontario.
Ontario, and perhaps there were others.
It had a lot of appeal for a lot of us.
Piepenburgs, that was another
Piepenburg,
Mhm.
yeah.
who went to Vancouver.
Mhm.
You even thought of it?
Thought of it,
Moving
but obviously we didn't decide to do it. But yeah.
Well, I think
It wasn't
that's,
so possible for an
I think that's an
architect to...
interesting measure of the feelings that people had, probably
Yeah.
interest in leaving the country.
Well, another place, Costa Rica. We just fairly recently we've made a trip to Costa Rica with some Quaker group. Costa Rica is a country that has no military. They abolished the military down there, and seem to be doing quite well. And a lot of Quakers, or numbers of Quakers from all over the country, have moved permanently to Costa Rica, and we have members of our meeting that are down there now because they prefer that kind of a government, and it is democratic to an extent. Unfortunately, they depend heavily on the United States foreign aid for funding, but nevertheless they maintain a democratic system down there.
We did notice a lot of policemen around with lots of guns, however. And there's no army, but the police seem to be heavily armed.
Big militia.
Yeah, every street corner in the center of the city there. And
You mentioned purchasing the Helen Allen house,
mhm.
but really you were active in meeting in the transition to Friend's house on Monroe Street, the purchase of Helen Allen house, and also the purchase of the meeting house we have today.
Well, it just so happened that when I was clerk, there was this big surge of people because of the Vietnam War and the interest in anti-war protesting and so on. And so we needed more space, and that's why we got the Helen Allen house. It was, house next door was available, and we managed to get Friends General Conference to help us purchase this house next door, and we're able to use it to spread out into, and it was named after Helen Allen because she was the one that started the original little fund for buying the first house on Monroe Street, because she had found a dime on the street by a parking meter, and she, during monthly meeting for business one time, she decided that she'd start the building fund with this 10-cent item, and of course it took off from there.
But she herself personally contributed in many ways, monetarily and other
yes.
ways,
Oh yes,
to the meeting.
that was just a
all
little
during
joke, really, but
Yeah, but she was a great supporter of the meeting.
I think it must have been about 1954 or 5 that the meeting bought that house on Monroe Street. Judging by the fact that you
Yeah.
said there was a work day scheduled there, and what work
Yeah.
day would you need if you were renting a house
Yeah,
for your meeting place? So I think we recall remodeling that house. Nat drew some plans for the changing of it. And
How did it work then? How was the house organized?
how did the plans work?
Yeah, how was the house organized for as a meeting house?
Oh,
well,
It
it
had-
was it was an old house with a very typical. It had a big front porch,
on
and
Monroe.
and the bedrooms projected out over this open porch, and you came in from Monroe Street up the center, walked onto the porch and into the front door. Well, we enclosed the porch and took out the front wall of the first floor and put the entrance around on the side from Prospect. So you came in the middle of the side, and then the meeting room was the hall where the porch had been, and the 2 front rooms. Then we had a dining room and a kitchen and a basement. We found that the basement didn't have enough headroom when we got down there, so it's probably this work day here that I
And to
found.
lower the floor.
The work day was to bring shovel, and we lowered the basement floor by about 1.5 feet by shoveling dirt into wheelbarrows. It was a garage. It was a garage down there before, so there was a slope about like that going up
Oh,
out of
those
the garage.
Ridiculous garages.
And we lowered that floor and poured another slab in there so you could stand up straight in there. And the partitions between the classrooms were
Curtains.
curtains, not as heavy as those right there, and they don't do much for 3 or 4 classes, each with a teacher trying to convey some message. But it worked. Well, at
Sort
least
of.
we used it for a long time, and
I'm sorry. Go ahead. And the upstairs? How was that?
upstairs was, well, we officially it was an apartment because we could not use it for school purposes or church purposes because we didn't have a second exit, and it was
Fire.
it wasn't. You have to meet the fire codes, so everything has to be on one floor, or you have to be a fire resistant building. So actually the upper floor wasn't doing us a lot of good. We were getting some rent actually from people we had renting up there who helped us take care of the building for a little relief on the rent.
They're usually Quakers.
Yeah.
not always.
So how was the Helen Allen House used then?
Same way.
Same kind of way.
Same way. We
Apartment.
used Sunday school classes on the first floor and rented the second floor.
So there would be two meetings next door to that?
No, it was just overflow first day school space in the Helen Allen House, and or small groups could meet there. And at one point, I think that was also when I was clerk, we had as an experiment to use the meeting house more, we had a Head Start program to use that Helen Allen House. And I think they tried using the meeting house too.
Yeah, we even did that.
And we
tried
had
that
a
at
hard
meeting
time
house.
maintaining it because the one was carpeted and the other was not, but meeting house without carpet was too noisy and the effort was not successful. But for 2 years, I think we did have a Head Start program there.
I think actually we did try to have two separate meetings going on simultaneously. That when the first one filled up, then the next people would go over to the other place.
Did we?
Well, what happened was the next people never did go over there. They just stood up in the corridor, and we couldn't get them to go over there, which doesn't is understandable because you walk into a big room, there's nobody there. When that wasn't what you came for, you wanted to be with the others in the meeting. So, but it did work out all right for Sunday school.
Could have 3 classes over there.
And then when we finally decided to move over to where we are now, we sold them both together. And
We actually didn't discover that place on. It was not. I think it was. Who was it? The man who discovered this old church that was for sale. I'm trying to remember his name. He lived in the house next door and was the custodian of it for the first year or two. And he was the one who scouted around the neighborhood and found this place that was for sale, which just happened to be perfect size for us. Not perfect inside, but plenty of room. So that was a big stroke of luck as far as we were concerned, finding it.
Was this a long search that you went through, or was there sort of a crisis that precipitated the sale or the purchase of this?
no, it was I think the meeting knew that we were overcrowded and people just were looking for a place. You can't just suddenly find a place. You have to start looking, and when you find a place, and you know you want it, you have to be prepared to go get it, which we did. But we suffered along for quite a while with those crowded conditions, but it was just a kind of a stroke of luck that we found this other place, which was so close to where we had been. We wanted to be close to the university so that we could attract people from the campus, and the size, and its location being fairly close to downtown was very good. We
also wanted to be off Monroe Street if we could because it was so noisy in that other meeting house. Had to keep the windows closed. And in summer, it was almost unbearable. So the fact of even being a half a block off Monroe Street made a huge difference in the noise factor. So we were pretty happy about finding that.
yeah.
And of course, ever since we've moved there, we've been involved in the 2 stages of remodeling that. Nat didn't do the drawings, but we've been on the building committee for
A while.
at least 10 years, I guess, and so we were involved in the determining of how it should be remodeled. It was generally agreed the space was big enough, but not rightly assorted. And I think it's worked out quite well the way it is now. So that's been kind of an effort too, actually, hasn't it? In the last 5 years or so. And I guess it isn't quite finished yet. A little more.
We had, for a while, we had a meeting, a secondary meeting going on the east side here at 11 o'clock on Sundays. We moved around from the various homes of various east side members, like Francis Hole and ourselves and
Grace Brocker and
Grace Brocker used to live on this side, and Elizabeth
Crom.
And that worked out pretty well too, except that we found that some of our members on this side lived in very small apartments. I mean, students have some very small apartments, and when you get more than 10 or 12 in any one of their rooms, just isn't very satisfactory. So that sort of petered out, I guess. We actually, I think I like to go to the meeting where it is now. It isn't that far away, and we like to be with the people and see the people who come there.
A lot of questions for a moment.
Take a break.
Take a little break.
Yeah, you mentioned
Remember.
that you were involved with AFSC. If you want to talk about your involvement with AFSC and other friends who were involved with AFSC and what you did together, et cetera, that might be a good way.
Well, I
to
was
I don't
mentioning
remember
that
being-
I was part of I guess it was an AFSC committee at that time, early right after we bought that meeting house on Monroe Street. Must have been the early 50s. And for a number of years, the Friends collected clothing that was all supposed to be mended and clean, and we collected it from students for one. At the end of the school year, we'd put boxes in the dormitories and collect stuff they wanted to get rid of, and then we would meet over in the basement of the meeting house over on 2002 Monroe Street once a month or something. And Dorothy Ludwig, I remember, Dorothy Johnson, Walter's first wife, Agnes Hole, myself, Betty Boardman, I think,
Laura Schleifer and that.
Laura Schleifer. And we would sort all of this stuff and take it home to wash it if it needed cleaning or washing. We got a dry cleaner who volunteered to do it cheaply or for nothing. And we'd mend things and have sort of sewing bees where we'd sit around and talk, and just like the old time quilting things, and put everything in good shape, and then we'd pack it into boxes and send it off to Philadelphia to the AFSC. And we knit mittens, and we did all sorts of things. Sometimes they were shipped overseas, sometimes they were just used in this country. But there was a lot of getting clothing ready for relief projects in those days. And I remember a woman named Papadopoulos. What was her first name? Mary, who inspired people to make a garment, a loose garment that was worn by burnooses. That's right. Yes. we had some purple material, which she said would be appropriate in color. And it was wool. And we cut out and made all these burnooses and sent them over to Algeria, I think it was. And that was just a kind of a ad hoc little project that went on in the 50s. And it was that kind of thing, I think, that got people, made friends out of people. We had something in common to work for. And in those days, Lelia Bascom was around, and I remember she would contribute things. She was cutting down the size of her belongings, and she'd bring over a blanket, for instance, that she didn't need anymore, she thought. She had enough for one bed, and she'd bring over these little donations. So, and that led, I remember going to visit her when she was in the nursing home. I'd pay a visit to her every month or every week or so. And she was a wonderful character. She and our daughter Debbie had the same birthday, March 31st. And one year, Debbie was going to be 8. And she got the biggest charge out of the fact that in that year, she was going to be 82. So she could say, "You're going to be 8 and I'm 8 too." She just chuckled and chuckled over that. She thought that was just great. She had lots of little jokes she'd talk about. She said she just loved children, but in her day it wasn't polite to have children if you weren't married. So she couldn't have any.
So those were the people involved in the AFSC relief efforts.
Yeah.
Let's see.
So you've probably known Frances Hall longer than anybody in the meeting then.
Well, I don't know that.
Well, you
I
must,
think that's
because
probably true. Yeah.
39, yeah.
you knew him before he came here, and
Well, I knew him as a teacher.
yeah.
Called her Master Francis. Yeah.
Master Francis?
Hmm. The women were teacher so-and-so, and the men were master so-and-so. And we didn't think a thing about that. That was very normal. But the Boardmans were a couple who were in the early days of when we attended meeting. The Boardmans were always there. And Mildred Ashman and her sister Irma Duncan, and Frances and Agnes Hole, and Johnsons were pretty soon after that, I think. Well,
You might mention what Irma Duncan, not Irma Duncan, Mildred Ashman and her husband lived
Dan.
over on the other side of Lake Monona, and they had a big garden there with lots of peonies, and they offered them in bunches to various merchants in town for $1?
No, they offered the cut flowers to the meeting as a sort of a fundraising thing. The meeting would then be responsible for picking them up and delivering them to banks and individuals who wanted them for a party or just for a nice bouquet. And we had to organize people who could drive a car around and deliver them, and other people would arrange to find people who want to buy them. So there were maybe, I don't know, 50 dozen or 50 bunches of peonies. I think they were bunches of 6. And you could order all white ones or all pink ones or whatever, and they had many beautiful varieties. And this was an annual thing with Mildred Ashman.
The one of the things that made it interesting was you couldn't deliver the peonies until they bloomed. and you could, when you took the order from First Wisconsin Bank, you couldn't promise what day they were going to be there, or what day you had lined up somebody to deliver them. So there was always a panic button was pushed on the day that they bloomed, so that we could get people over there, pick them up, and deliver them, and collect the money, all at the right time before.
$1 for half a dozen big, beautiful peonies was quite a bargain, so the banks really snapped them up.
But it was amazing how big a thing, an event. It was a big event of the year.
I think we must have made about $50 out of the whole thing,
Yeah.
but it was another one of those little projects.
It's been a lot easier just to ask everybody for a donation of $1, but it wasn't nearly as much fun.
Yeah.
So everybody got involved in that one, huh?
Yeah.
Quite a few people, yeah. People with cars and little time. I took great pleasure when we moved to the new meeting house in sort of swiping some peony plants from the Link House gardens, because we were leaving the place, and Betty Richardson suggested that we might be able to use some, and transplanting them in front of the meeting house in honor of Mildred Ashman and her husband Ben, because I thought that was very appropriate to have in that garden. So happened that the first year they bloomed, after they'd been put in, one of the little kids who shall be nameless, before they opened, twisted every bud off. So it was a little frustrating for a year or so.
Oh, there now?
Yeah, they're still there. They're in front of the window that is in that little meeting room on the corner. And this year they did bloom. But that was kind of a nice thing to remember the Ashmans by.
Well, there was Mildred Ashman. She had quite a spirit. She was
Yes.
a heart of gold kind of.
Mm-hmm. So was her husband.
Ben.
Mildred was I think Mildred and her mother and Irma were really one of the first groups of people who were involved in meeting here, along with the Holes. But Mildred was I think she'd been a school teacher, and she was just excellent with children. She knew how to respond to them. And she was a very motherly type who she and her sister Irma both gave very good messages in meeting fairly frequently, I remember, and short and to the point, and very nice messages. And right up until the end, she was involved with the meeting as much as she could be. Mildred, I mean, she was the corresponding clerk for a long time and would always write little notes to people when somebody needed to be thanked or welcomed into the meeting or something like that. She was the one who did it for years, just years. And of course, Irma was famous for being the instigator of the potlucks at her house. She loved to have people come to her house, but she was getting old and decided she really couldn't handle having a whole meeting or gathering of 6 or 8 people, and so she decided what the heck, she'd invite people to come to a potluck, and she would just provide the house and coffee and maybe one thing, and everybody else would bring the food, and everybody loved it.
Are you saying this is the beginning of the Friendly Eights Institution?
No, it didn't really have anything to do with that. It was just that she was kind of housebound, didn't drive, and didn't have terribly good health, and she really enjoyed entertaining, but she couldn't do the whole thing, and so she hit upon the idea of inviting just calling people and saying, would you come to my house on such and such a night, and I'm going to have 2 or 3 other people, and would you bring a dessert or something? And they didn't mind doing that, and it was fun. So it was kind of an invitational potluck, and she did that maybe once a month or something. No, I think it was Betty Boardman that started the idea of the Friendly Eights, wasn't it? Didn't she tell us that the other day
remember.
when we were
I guess
when
she
we
did.
saw her?
Yeah, she did
Yeah,
say
she
that.
said she'd been in a meeting where that happened, and she brought the idea to a meeting. And that's been going on for years, just at least 10 or 15 years, I think, we've been having those.
Friendly Aids?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That's another thing I've been involved in the meeting, actually, is hospitality. And that was one of the ideas that Hospitality Committee handles, getting people together in that way, and then also for special occasions like a shower or a bridal party or handling the weddings or funerals, or meetings for memorial meetings. And all of those arrangements have to be done by somebody. So that's been one of the things I've enjoyed doing too. A lot of the people on those on that committee have been going on for years too, like Louise Lund. She's practically Mrs. Hospitality. But we started by just serving coffee after a meeting, and that was maybe the 60s or something we started doing that. Just providing some reason for people to hang around afterwards and talk. And it sort of developed into potlucks. And
Sure, I remember making postum in the kitchen at 2002.
really?
Sure.
For certain people who didn't want regular coffee. Mm-hmm.
Right.
That's right.
Something brown, but not coffee.
Yeah. I remember Alan Roberts never wanted coffee. He wanted something that wasn't caffeine.
Uh-huh.
I was thinking when you mentioned some of the people who aren't around anymore that we've recently seen the Vias, who used to be in meeting until about 20 years ago, I think.
Yeah.
And they were very involved with open housing. Margaret particularly was working very hard to have housing where people were not discriminated against by their race or their color. And she was trying to get an open housing law passed in the city council. And there were groups of people who were
You close the screen
telephone.
screen door.
We need to do that. Yeah, it's been open all this time, hasn't it?
Yeah, I noticed.
Bugs everywhere. Gee, we forgot all about that. Well, anyway, the Vias are come back every now and then, and they're really terrific people. We've met a lot of wonderful people in the meeting through the years. They've been fascinating array. And then we went to visit the Nodas, who were Japanese Americans who came here. He was a research person at the university, and their family lived right next door to us on University Bay Drive, so we were very good friends of theirs. And we've seen Betty Boardman, who has moved away and may come back again, actually, now. But these are all people that I think of as very good friends and who've been, in one way or another, doing much work for the meeting and to help the community, I think.
What are your recollections of Jean Boardman?
You talk.
I designed a house for the Boardmans out in Crestwood, and I must say that I got more information from Betty Boardman than I got from Gina Boardman about what the needs of the family would be. But Gene was always seemed to me to be very quiet and reserved, but he was very active on various committees and various projects. Right up until the time he died, he was a very regular participant down at the Luke House. He was there every month, one night every month, to serve food, bring his share of the food. I wish I had had a chance to take a course from him, but I think that his experiences during the war must have were very exciting, and he knew Japanese and Chinese, and of course the Marine Corps thought that well, it was great to have somebody in that with those skills, and they used him during the war. And of course, I guess his field in history was China,
Southeast
China
Asia,
or
yeah.
Southeast Asia, and his knowledge was certainly very important.
He was a very regular member. I remember who always came to monthly meeting for business and was spoke up in meeting regularly, both meeting for worship and also in business meeting. Always had opinions and was, I remember being quite gratified when at one point when we were the building committee was trying to convince the meeting for business that in fact there did need to be some remodeling done on this new building that we bought to make a better entrance and to provide more space. And everybody had been objecting a lot to spending money, and there was a lot of foot dragging, and Gene was very to the point, and he said, I think it ought to be done. And he was, and this was really not terribly long before he died, I think just a year or so before he died. But he had a lot of, when he spoke, people listened to him, and I think he, as one of the older members of the meeting, had quite a lot of influence that way. He was a weighty friend.
I don't remember him working on work days or...
Oh, yes, I do.
Do you?
Uh-huh, yes. Mm-hmm. Right up until the last year or so.
Yeah, maybe so. I have a feeling of remembering him in the background somewhere. But he was always willing and able to support improvements and
Mm-hmm.
things that the meeting wanted to do.
That's right.
You mentioned the phase too. The phase. Francis Fay was, I think he was studying horticulture, and I think he ended up getting either a master's or a PhD in psychology, or
Later.
later, and
Counseling.
Nancy, his wife, was also a psychologist, and they worked with, helped us build our house on University Bay Drive. I mean, Francis, being a good horticulturist, could wield a mean hammer and saw a mean board.
Well, he had some training.
He'd had some experience with that, yeah. And then they moved down to the University of North Carolina, where we stop and see him occasionally. Francis is now retired, and he is a house husband. Their kids, 3 kids, have all left the home, and Francis buys the food, cooks the food, while Nancy goes off to work.
She's younger.
Yeah, she's quite a bit younger.
Mm.
At some clinics, like
In Raleigh.
in Raleigh, and they're really great people. They're the ones that got us, or got me anyway, thinking about looking at retirement homes, because I think the last time we saw them, they had just signed up for the one at Guilford, Friends Retirement Home down there, as a place they want to go when the time comes. They're not about to move there as long as Francis can cook and Nancy can go to work. But we've enjoyed them. Another thing Francis used to do, he had a big catamaran, which he sailed on the Atlantic Ocean. He'd sail out to the Bahamas all by himself in that, and he was a little younger.
Well, something I remember myself about the Friends in the 50s was that they were part of seemed to be like a pretty healthy, strong nucleus of people that really got the Madison meeting established, at least as far as I could tell. And I guess what I'd like to hear from you is whether or not that perception was accurate.
Are you talking about the phase?
No, I'm talking about the phase and the Boardmans and how somehow or other this group, fairly small group of people, coalesced after in the 50s, and the meeting kind of took off. I mean, the critical mass was achieved, and there were a lot of vibrant people around. And
Yeah, another couple that I remember very well was the Hugheses, Grace and Merritt Hughes, who were from, I would say, the early 50s involved also. They certainly, by the time we bought that building on Monroe Street, they were involved, because I remember it was Merritt's little phrase that caught everybody's attention at the time we were talking about buying this house, or buying a place. He said we couldn't go on being like a hermit crab that lived in other people's homes. And everybody sort of laughed, and then realized that is what we're doing, isn't it? And maybe it would be helpful to the meeting to grow if we were to have our own place. Some people objected strongly to the idea of spending money on a place, but other people who prevailed, obviously, realized that you can't do much if you're just stuck in one room, and proved to be true. But he and Grace were very good members who were extremely active and spoke very well in meeting. Another person was Elspeth Epstein, who was a fairly close neighbor of ours, and she in Shorewood, so we knew her very well, and she was always willing to do little things like bake a cake for an occasion or a work day or something. She couldn't work. She was very old, but she loved to do things like that where she could, and she made curtains for the 2002 Monroe Street library, I remember, and I bought the material and she made the curtains. And another time she did slip covers for some old cushions that were donated with chairs, and I'd pick out the material and she'd make the slip covers, and things like that went on all the time. Dorothy Ludwig and I and Betty Boardman made curtains for the old meeting room, and it just was constant that things like that were happening. But Merritt Hughes had the most wonderful way of speaking and meeting. I don't know if you remember that, Pete, do you? And in business meeting, he was so funny that he could make some wry statement about the situation that would get everybody to laugh. It was fun just to go to meeting then. Hear his reactions to things.
Oh, he was a famous professor of English, specializing in Milton, and you have to have studied English to know who Milton was, and to know what an unusual person must be who's going to spend his life studying Milton. But he was very eloquent, and sometimes you would, if you weren't listening, you'd think he was talking about Milton when he was actually talking about getting somebody to move his car was in his way out front, or some other important cause that the meeting had. They were very heavy, weighty Quakers. Was she the Quaker from England, or?
She was from Scotland.
She was from Scotland.
He met
that's
her
right.
there, I think, and not sure about that.
And he was a he was a military man and proud of it. I don't think he ever denied that, but that aspect of his philosophy.
But he was also a good Quaker.
Yeah.
Amazing.
Well, yeah.
I recall him with looking maybe like an English colonel in the,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
or something, with
He
a very
always-
short haircut.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
He always wore a raincoat that looked sort of military
Yeah.
and cut.
Yeah. Well, and of course Walter Johnson and his first wife Dorothy, they were very active, and I think Walter Johnson is one of the signatories of the corporation that owns the building. He and Gene Boardman and
Probably Merritt Hughes.
perhaps Merritt Hughes and maybe Francis Hall were the members who signed on when we had to become a corporation. We had to have a corporation to own the building. The church can't just own it. It has to be a legal entity, and so the corporation papers were signed by them, and there may have been a couple of others.
Walter Johnson wrote us recently after his heart attack. We had written him, and he said he didn't think he was going to be doing a lot of traveling anymore because of his heart attack, but that he wasn't going to let his meeting membership die, that he was going to stay a member of the Madison meeting and hope that people would come and visit him there. His heart is still here, I think. Really.
One of the reasons, one of the things we liked about, or about Walter Johnson was that he comes from, his home is Three Oaks, Michigan, which is a little town in southwestern Michigan, near where your family's summer farm was. And if you ever thought you'd seen an unimpressive little town, you should see Three Oaks. Well, Walter Johnson graduated from high school, went to the University of Michigan, got a degree in architecture, and a degree in law, and became a city planner for the city of Madison. And from there he went to state planner for the state of Wisconsin, and from there to the regional planner for the Brandywine region, which takes in the entire watershed of the Delaware River. And his offices were in downtown Philadelphia, where his boss was that former notorious mayor
Rizzo?
Rizzo.
Frank Rizzo?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Walter was a very calm, steady person. I don't think if he hadn't been, he never would have been able to live with Rizzo. But apparently he did well.
Maybe why he had a heart attack, though.
Well,
Suppressed
that
all
was-
that stress all those years, maybe.
yeah,
I don't know. He was a hard worker.
yeah.
Who else do we remember now? I remember Gene Boardman for his ability to give a judicious answer to problems that came up in meeting, and also because he, like Joe Elder, was so good at piano and singing and playing the organ. He was a standby for any time we wanted to sing hymns or do anything. He was one of the two people in the meeting who could do that. And when Irma Duncan would have her
Yeah.
musicals at Christmas time, he and Joe both were able to pitch in and play the organ that she had, which she eventually donated to the meeting. And so he was wonderful about that sort of thing.
I'll think of some more names later, but I can't right now.
Yeah.
It's getting to be pretty late. It's almost 10.
Maybe it's a good time to end.
Probably is.
Yeah, I think so.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Well,
Hope you got something out of it that you didn't have before, but
Well, I think
I'm sure it's all kind of repetitive to a certain extent.